Sometimes the most precious things come disguised as burdens we never asked for. In 1860s New Mexico, when a desperate father traded his daughter for 2 chickens and a bottle of whiskey, nobody could have imagined it would become the most beautiful love story of redemption ever told. Matthias Giant Steele was a feared bounty hunter who stood 6'6" and had a reputation that cleared saloons. He'd spent years tracking outlaws across 3 territories, never missing his target. But when this silent, dirt-smudged girl named Cora clutched her ragged doll and looked up at him with eyes full of quiet strength, everything changed. What started as a simple trade became something Matthias never expected. This little girl would melt the frost around his calloused heart and remind him of the family he'd lost long ago. Together, they would learn what it means to be whole again across harsh deserts and brutal winters. But would Matthias discover the truth about love and redemption before Cora's dangerous past came calling? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had barely crested the jagged horizon when Matthias Steele pulled his silver pocket watch from his vest, the metal warm against his calloused fingers. 7:15 in the morning, same as always. He wound the timepiece with practiced precision, listening to the familiar tick that had marked his days for the past 8 years. Ever since Martha had pressed it into his hands on their wedding day, her eyes bright with promises of a future that would never come. The watch face caught the early light, reflecting back the ghost of his own weathered features. 42 years old, though the harsh New Mexico territory had aged him beyond his years. His hair, once the color of autumn wheat, now showed threads of silver at the temples. Deep lines mapped the corners of his eyes, carved there by sun, wind, and the weight of too many graves left in his wake. Matthias tucked the watch away and surveyed his camp. Everything in its place, everything purposeful. His bedroll lay precisely folded beside a circle of stones that had contained countless fires. His rifle stood propped against a gnarled pinyon pine, barrels cleaned and oiled. 3 horses, his massive black stallion Thunder, a sturdy pack mare, and a spare mount, grazed nearby on the sparse desert grass, their reins secured to stakes. Driven deep into the hard-pan earth, this had been his life for 8 years, moving from one bounty to the next, carrying death in his saddlebags and justice on his shoulders. The territorial marshals knew his name. Outlaws whispered it around campfires, their voices dropping to fearful murmurs when they spoke of the giant who never missed, never quit, never showed mercy to those who'd chosen the wrong side of the law. But mercy, that was a luxury Matthias had buried along with his wife and the child she'd carried. He could still remember that terrible winter morning when he'd returned from a routine prisoner transport to find their small cabin cold and still. Martha had been in her 6th month, glowing with the joy of impending motherhood. The fever had taken them both while he was away, earning his $30 in blood money. The guilt had hollowed him out, carved away everything soft and tender until only the hunter remained. For 8 years, he'd moved through the territory like a force of nature, bringing in rustlers, killers, and thieves with methodical efficiency. He took the hardest cases, the most dangerous men. Part of him hoped one of them might be fast enough, might finally give him the peace that eluded him in the long, sleepless nights. Now, as he prepared his morning coffee over the rekindled fire, Matthias heard the approach of riders from the east, 3 horses moving slow and deliberate. He'd been expecting them, had sent word to the trading post at Rio Perdido 3 days ago that he'd be waiting at Devil's Backbone, the rocky outcropping that served as a landmark for 20 miles in any direction. The lead rider came into view. First, a thin man in a tattered coat that had once been brown, but now showed the faded grey of too many hard seasons. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken deep in their sockets, and when he spoke, his voice carried the hollow echo of desperation. "You, Steele?" the man called out, though there was no doubt. Few men in the territory matched Matthias's imposing frame. I am. Matthias remained seated by his fire, coffee cup steady in his massive hands. You'd be Isaiah Brennan. The man nodded, dismounting with the careful movements of someone whose body had been pushed beyond its limits. Behind him, two other figures slid down from their horses, a boy of perhaps 14 with Brennan's same hollow cheeks, and a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The girl clutched a ragged cloth doll against her chest, its faded fabric and missing button eyes speaking of countless nights of desperate comfort. Her dress, once white with small blue flowers, hung loose on her thin frame. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd ridden into sight, just watched Matthias, with eyes that seemed far too old for her small face. "This here's my boy Tommy," Brennan said, his hand falling on the teenager's shoulder. "And this," he hesitated, something passing across his features like a shadow. "This is Cora." The girl's grip tightened on her doll, but she didn't look up. Matthias studied the three of them, taking in details with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read danger in the set of shoulders, the placement of hands. Brennan was nervous, sweating despite the cool morning air. The boy seemed sullen, angry in the way that children get when the adult world disappoints them beyond measure. But the girl, Cora, she was different, watchful, waiting. "You said you had something to trade," Matthias said, his voice carrying no judgment. He'd learned long ago that desperate men made desperate choices, and it wasn't his place to question the circumstances that brought them to his fire. Brennan's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Crops failed 3 seasons running. Lost. The farm to the bank last month. Got nowhere to go, no way to feed. He stopped, glancing at the children. "My boy, he's strong, can work. But the girl," another pause, heavier this time, "she's been nothing but trouble since her mama died. Won't speak, has these nightmares that wake the whole house. We can't." "Papa," the boy said, his voice cracking with adolescent emotion, "you promised we'd find another way." "There ain't another way, son," Brennan's voice broke. "You'll understand when you're older. Sometimes a man has to make choices that tear his heart right out of his chest." Matthias set down his coffee cup and stood, his shadow falling across the small group. At 6'6", he towered over them all, but when he looked down at Cora, something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. She was so small, so fragile, and yet there was something unbreakable in the way she held herself. "What exactly are you proposing?" Matthias asked. Brennan reached into his coat and withdrew a cloth sack that clinked softly. "I got 2 laying hens, good birds. And this," he produced, a bottle of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the firelight, worth maybe $15 all told. "I know it ain't much, but you want to trade me a child for chickens and whiskey?" Matthias's voice remained level, but there was something dangerous underneath it now. "She ain't really mine," Brennan said quickly. "Found her wandering near Messiah 3 months ago, half dead from thirst. Took her in out of Christian charity, but I can't keep her. Can't afford another mouth to feed." Matthias looked down at Cora again. She was watching him now, those dark eyes holding secrets he couldn't begin to guess. Her doll was missing one arm, the stuffing leaking out in small tufts, but she held it like it contained all the treasures in the world. "Girl," he said gently, "what's your name?" Cora's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. She just stared at him with those haunting eyes. "She don't talk much," Brennan said. "Like I said, trouble since day one." Something hot and angry flared in Matthias's chest. This man, this father, speaking about a child like she was nothing more than a burden to be shed. It reminded him too much of his own father, a hard man who'd seen children as mouths to feed rather than hearts to cherish. "I'll take her," Matthias heard himself say. The words surprised him as much as they did Brennan. He'd had no intention of agreeing to this transaction, had only agreed to meet these people out of curiosity. But looking down at Cora, seeing the Way she held herself with such quiet dignity despite her circumstances, something in him responded. "You will." Brennan's relief was palpable. "I mean, that's good. She'll be better off with someone who can provide for her proper." Matthias doubted that. His life was no place for a child, always moving, always hunting, always dancing with violence. But there was something about this girl that called to the part of him he'd thought was buried with Martha. Maybe it was the way she held her doll, or the strength in her small shoulders, or simply the fact that she deserved better than being traded like livestock. "The nearest mission is 3 days' ride south," Matthias said, more to himself than to Brennan. "Sisters there will take her. See, she's properly cared for." Brennan nodded eagerly. "That sounds real good, real Christian thing to do." But as the transaction was completed, chickens transferred, whiskey handed over, Matthias caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. There, tucked partially under Cora's collar, was the edge of a bruise, dark and finger-shaped. It spoke of hands that had gripped too tight, of fear that went deeper than simple abandonment. When it came time for goodbyes, the boy Tommy knelt beside Cora with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. You're the bravest person I know." Cora reached out and touched Tommy's cheek with one small hand, her first gesture of emotion since they'd arrived. Then she turned and walked toward Matthias's horses, her bare feet silent on the rocky ground. As Brennan and his son rode away into the morning haze, Matthias found himself alone with a child he'd never intended to acquire and a responsibility he'd never wanted. But as he watched Cora examine Thunder with careful, reverent touches, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about what he wanted at all. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, marking time as it always had. But for the first time in 8 years, Matthias wondered if those measured moments might lead somewhere other than another grave and another bounty collected. He had 3 days to reach the mission, 3 days to keep one small girl safe from whatever shadows seemed to follow in her wake. Looking down at Cora as she whispered something to Thunder that only the horse could hear, Matthias Steele had no idea that those 3 days would change everything he thought he knew about himself, about family, and about the strange ways that grace could arrive disguised as a burden he'd never asked for. The mission bells of San Miguel were still 2 days away when Matthias found the letter. He'd been tracking their back trail since dawn, a habit born of 8 years hunting men who often had friends willing to seek revenge. What he found instead were the hoofprints of 3 horses moving fast, and then the crumpled paper caught on a sage bush like a flag of surrender. The parchment was stained dark with what could only be blood, the ink smeared but still legible in the harsh morning light. Matthias's weathered hands smoothed the creases as he read, his jaw tightening with each word. "Isaiah, the girl knows what she saw. Daniels is dead. Martinez too. They found the bodies this morning. Someone talked. Get rid of her before they connect her to us. Do it quiet and do it permanent. The railroad money depends on silence." Fletcher. A chill ran down Matthias's spine that had nothing to do with the desert wind. He looked back toward their small camp, where Cora sat beside the dying fire, feeding Thunder pieces of hardtack from her small hand. She'd been silent since the transaction yesterday, communicating only through gestures and those penetrating. Dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets too heavy for such a young soul. Now he understood why. The letter explained the bruises, the fear that seemed to radiate from her small frame, the way she startled at sudden sounds. This child wasn't just unwanted, she was hunted. Someone had killed to keep her quiet, and someone else had been willing to trade her away rather than face whatever consequences her survival might bring. Matthias folded the letter carefully, his mind already calculating distances and possibilities. The nearest town was Broken Rock, 3 hours north. The mission lay south, but if men were hunting Cora, both directions might lead into trouble. He mounted Thunder and rode back to camp, finding Cora exactly where he'd left her. She looked up at his approach, and he saw something new in her expression, a wariness that suggested she knew their peaceful morning was about to end. "Pack your things, little one," he said gently, dismounting with practiced ease. "We need to move." Cora clutched her ragged doll tighter and pointed toward the south, where the mission lay. Her meaning was clear. Wasn't that where they were headed? "Change of plans," Matthias said, already kicking dirt over the fire. "Sometimes the safest path isn't the shortest one." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching riders echoed across the desert floor. 3 horses, moving fast and purposeful. Matthias's hand dropped instinctively to the colt at his hip, but he didn't draw. "Not yet. Get behind Thunder," he told Cora, his voice calm but firm. "Stay low." The riders came into view as black silhouettes against the morning sun, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. They spread out as they approached, a practiced maneuver that spoke of men familiar with violence. The leader raised his hand in what might have been a friendly greeting, but Matthias had seen too many killers to be fooled by such gestures. "Morning?" the man called out, his voice carrying a false joviality. "Name's Fletcher, looking for a friend of mine, Isaiah Brennan. Heard he might have passed this way." "I haven't seen him," Matthias replied, his massive frame positioned between the riders and where Cora crouched behind Thunder. "Just me and my daughter heading south." Fletcher's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the camp with the attention of a man looking for something specific. "Your daughter, you say? Funny thing, Brennan mentioned he had a little girl with him, about 8 years old, dark hair. Wouldn't happen to be the same child, would it?" "Like I said," Matthias repeated, his voice dropping to the dangerous register that had made outlaws across 3 territories think twice about reaching for their guns. "Haven't seen Brennan." The tension stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. Fletcher's 2 companions shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their weapons. Behind Thunder, Matthias could hear Cora's quick, frightened breathing. "See, that's a problem," Fletcher continued, his friendly mask slipping away to reveal something cold and predatory underneath. "Because we really need to find that particular little girl. She witnessed something she shouldn't have, and we need to make sure she understands the importance of keeping quiet about it." "Lot of little girls in the territory," Matthias said, "most of them smart enough to stay quiet when they need to." Fletcher laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This one's different. This one saw 3 men get shot down in cold blood outside the Mercia Bank. This one might be able to identify the shooters to a federal marshal." The pieces fell into place in Matthias's mind, like tumblers in a lock. Bank robbery, murder, and a child who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, who'd seen faces that were supposed to remain hidden. No wonder Brennan had been so eager to get rid of her. The man had probably been paid to keep her quiet, maybe even to ensure she never made it to anyone who might listen to her story. "Even if I had seen this girl," Matthias said carefully, "sounds like she's been through enough. Might be better to let sleeping dogs lie." "Can't do that," Fletcher replied, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. "Too much money involved. Railroads paying good money to make sure certain stories never get told." Behind Thunder, Cora made a small sound, not quite a whimper, but something close. Matthias's protective instincts flared like a struck match. He'd failed to protect Martha and their unborn child, but he'd be damned if he'd fail this little girl. "Well then," Matthias said, his own hand settling into position, "seems like we might have ourselves a disagreement." Fletcher's smile was sharp as a knife blade. 3 against 1, bounty hunter. Even you aren't that good." "Maybe not," Matthias admitted. "But I'm willing to bet I can take at least 2 of you with me. Question is, which 2 of you want to die today?" The standoff stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours. Desert wind whispered through the sagebrush. Thunder stamped nervously, sensing the violence that hung in the air like smoke. Then Cora did something that surprised them all. She stepped out from behind Thunder, her small hand clutching her ragged doll, and looked directly at Fletcher with those dark, knowing eyes. "I remember you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the desert stillness. They were the first words Matthias had heard her speak. "You shot the man with the gold teeth." Fletcher's face went white, then red with rage. "Little bitch," he snarled, his gun clearing leather. But Matthias was already moving. 8 years of hunting killers had honed his reflexes to a deadly edge. His Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic, spitting flame and thunder. Fletcher pitched backward from his saddle, a spreading red stain across his chest. The other 2 riders were fast, but not fast enough. Matthias's second shot took the man on the left through the shoulder, spinning him around. The third rider got his gun clear and managed one wild shot that whistled past Matthias's ear before the bounty hunter's third bullet found its mark. In the space of 10 seconds, 3 men lay sprawled in the desert dust. 2 dead, 1 writhing and groaning from his shoulder wound. Matthias kept his gun trained on the wounded man as he approached. "Your friends are past caring," he said quietly, "but you still have choices. Tell me who sent you, and maybe you'll live to see another sunset." The wounded man spat blood and glared up at him. "Railroad owns this territory," he gasped. "They got money and they got reach. You can't protect her forever." "Maybe not forever," Matthias agreed, "but I can protect her today." He looked back at Cora, who was watching the aftermath with those disturbingly mature eyes. No tears, no hysteria, just a quiet acceptance that spoke of someone who'd already seen too much violence for one small lifetime. "We need to go," he told her gently. "These men have friends and they'll come looking." Cora nodded and walked to where Thunder waited, her bare feet careful among the rocks. As Matthias helped her up onto the big horse's back, she looked down at him with something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Those 2 words hit Matthias harder than any bullet ever had. In them he heard trust, hope, and the beginning of something he'd thought was buried forever. The need to protect, to nurture, to be worthy of someone's faith in him. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, leaving the mission and civilization, far behind, Matthias realized that his simple plan to drop Cora at the nearest orphanage had died in the desert along with Fletcher and his men. This child was his responsibility now, whether he'd wanted it or not, and somewhere in the depths of his calloused heart, he was beginning to think he might actually want it after all. The canyon country of northern New Mexico stretched before them like the backbone of some ancient sleeping giant. Red sandstone walls rose on either side of the narrow trail, their surfaces carved by countless centuries of wind and water into fantastic shapes that seemed to shift and change as the sun moved across the sky. Matthias had chosen this route deliberately. The winding passages and hidden valleys would make them difficult to track, and he knew these canyons better than most. Years of hunting fugitives had taught him every cave, every water source, every escape route carved into the living rock behind. Him on Thunder's broad back, Cora rode in silence, her small arms wrapped around his waist for balance. She'd spoken only once since the shooting 3 days ago, to ask for water when the sun was at its highest. But Matthias could feel her watching everything, those dark eyes taking in every detail of their journey with an intensity that seemed far beyond her 8 years. That evening, as he made camp in a sheltered alcove beneath an overhanging cliff, Matthias found himself stealing glances at the girl. She sat cross-legged on a flat stone, her ragged doll cradled in her lap, watching him work with the same careful attention she gave everything else. From his saddlebags, Matthias pulled out his mother's leather-bound Bible, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. The book fell open naturally to the pages where wildflowers had been pressed between thin sheets of tissue paper, desert lupines, Indian paintbrush, evening primrose. His mother had collected them during the family's journey west when he was barely older than Cora, preserving them as reminders of beauty found in harsh places. He hadn't opened the Bible in years, not since Martha's death had shattered his faith along with his heart. But something about Cora's presence, her quiet resilience in the face of unimaginable circumstances, made him think about grace and redemption in ways he'd almost forgotten. "My mother pressed these flowers," he said quietly. turning the pages. So Cora could see. She said every bloom was proof that God could make something beautiful anywhere, even in the hardest ground. Cora leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes studying the delicate petals preserved in their paper tombs. She reached out one finger as if to touch them, then pulled back, apparently understanding that such treasures were meant to be admired rather than handled. "You can touch them," Matthias said gently. "They're meant to be shared." This time Cora did reach out, her fingertip barely grazing the edge of a dried lupine blossom. When it crumbled slightly at her touch, she pulled back with a small gasp of distress. "It's all right," Matthias assured her. "Nothing lasts forever. That's what makes it precious." He closed the Bible carefully and set it aside, then began the familiar routine of preparing their evening meal. Hardtack and jerky, supplemented by wild onions he'd gathered along the trail, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. It wasn't much, but it would keep them going. As he worked, he became aware that Cora was studying him with the same intensity she'd given the flowers. When he looked up, she pointed to his hands, then made a gesture he didn't understand. "What is it, little?" "No," Cora tried again, pointing to his hands and then mimicking some kind of motion. After several attempts, Matthias realized she was asking about the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles and palms. Old wounds from fights, from ropes, from the hard life of a man who lived by violence. These, he held up his hands, studying. The pale lines that mapped his history across his skin. Oh, each one's got a story, most of them not very pleasant. Cora tilted her head, waiting. Matthias found himself talking without really meaning to, his voice low and reflective as the firelight danced between them. "This one here," he touched a long scar across his left palm. "Got that when I was about your age, trying to catch a wild horse my father said couldn't be broken. Tore my hand open on barbed wire, but I held on until that horse stopped fighting." He pointed to another mark, this one across his knuckles. "This one came from my first real fight, defending a girl at a church social who was being bothered by a man who wouldn't take no for an answer. Learned that day that sometimes fighting is the only way to protect what matters." Cora reached out tentatively and touched the scar on his palm, her small finger tracing the old wound with surprising gentleness. In that moment, Matthias felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and guilt he'd carried for 8 years. "What about you?" he asked softly. "What stories do your scars tell?" Cora's hand went instinctively to her throat, where the bruises from Brennan's grip were fading to yellow and green. Then she pulled up the sleeve of her dress, revealing more marks on her thin arms, some old, some newer, all speaking of hands that had held too tight and hearts that had cared too little. Matthias felt anger flare in his chest, hot and protective. "Who did this to you?" But Cora had withdrawn again, pulling her sleeves down and wrapping her arms around her doll. The moment of connection was broken, leaving only the crackling of the fire and the distant cry of a coyote echoing off the canyon. Walls. That night, as Matthias lay in his bedroll listening to the sounds of the desert, he heard Cora whimpering in her sleep. Soft, heartbroken sounds that spoke of nightmares too real to be easily dismissed. He rose quietly and knelt beside her, unsure what to do, but knowing he couldn't simply lie there and listen to her pain. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the night wind. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." Cora's eyes fluttered open, dark and lost in the starlight. For a moment she seemed not to recognize where she was, her small body tense with fear. Then she saw Matthias's face, and something in her expression relaxed. "Bad dreams?" he asked gently. She nodded, tears tracking silver down her cheeks. Without really thinking about it, Matthias began to hum, an old lullaby his mother had sung to him during the long nights of their journey west. The melody was simple, wordless, but it carried the weight of love and protection across the years. Gradually, Cora's breathing slowed and her eyes drifted closed. But this time, Instead of the restless tossing that had marked her earlier sleep, she seemed to find a measure of peace. Matthias stayed beside her until dawn, watching over her sleep and wondering when exactly he'd stopped thinking of her as a burden to be disposed of and started seeing her as something precious to be protected. The Bible lay nearby, its pressed flowers hidden between worn pages, reminding him that beauty could indeed bloom in the hardest ground. As the first light of morning painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and rose, Matthias realized that, somewhere in the space between her nightmares and his lullabies, they'd begun to become something he'd never expected. They'd begun to become a family. The silver locket had been hidden beneath Cora's dress for so long that Matthias almost missed it entirely. It was only when she bent to fill their water bottles at a desert spring that the chain caught the sunlight, revealing the small oval pendant that hung close to her heart. She noticed his gaze and quickly tucked the locket back beneath her collar, her dark eyes flashing with something between fear and defiance. It was the first real secret he'd seen her try to keep, and Matthias found himself respecting her for it. Everyone deserved something that belonged to them alone. They'd been traveling together for 2 weeks now, following game trails and old Apache paths deeper into the wilderness. Each day brought small revelations about the girl who rode behind him, the way she could predict weather changes by watching cloud formations, how she could move through brush without making a sound, the careful way she rationed her portions, as if she'd learned never to trust that more food would come. This morning, as they made their way through a narrow pass between towering red cliffs, Cora had done something that surprised him. When Thunder stumbled slightly on loose stone, she'd leaned forward and whispered something in the big horse's ear, words too soft for Matthias to hear. But Thunder's ears had pricked forward, and his stride had steadied immediately. "You're good with horses," Matthias observed, as they emerged from the pass into a wider valley dotted with pinyon pines. Cora nodded once, then held up 2 fingers. "You had 2 horses." Another nod, followed by a gesture toward her doll. She made the motion of riding, then pointed to the toy's missing arm. "Your doll rode horses too," Matthias guessed. For the first time since he'd known her, Cora almost smiled. She nodded enthusiastically and made the doll gallop through the air, its remaining arm flailing wildly. The sight of her playing, even briefly, made something warm unfold in Matthias's chest. That afternoon, they encountered other travelers for the first time since leaving the scene of the shooting. A small wagon train, heading east with families, who'd found the California dream harder than expected and were returning to familiar ground. Matthias counted 6 wagons, maybe 20 people total, including several children around Cora's age. He felt Cora tense behind him as they approached the circled wagons, her arms tightening around his waist. When the wagon master, a bearded man named Peters, invited them to share the evening fire, Matthias almost declined, but something in Cora's stillness made him reconsider. "Much obliged," he said, dismounting and helping Cora down from Thunder. "Been a while since we've had company." The travelers were curious about the odd pair, the giant bounty hunter and the silent child, but Western etiquette kept their questions polite and indirect. Peters mentioned they'd been warned about bandits in the area, and Matthias shared what he could without revealing too much about their own circumstances. As the evening wore on, Cora remained close to Matthias's side, watching the other children play with a mixture of longing and fear. When one of the girls, a freckled redhead named Mary, approached with a corn-husk doll, Cora clutched her own ragged toy protectively. "What's her name?" Mary asked, pointing to Cora's doll. Cora looked up at Matthias, uncertainty clear in her expression. It was the first time anyone had asked her a direct question in his presence, and he could see her struggling with whether to answer. "It's all right," he said gently. "You can tell her if you want to." "Hope," Cora whispered, so quietly that Mary had to lean closer to hear. "Her name is Hope." "That's a pretty name," Mary said. "Want to see my doll's dress? Mama made it from scraps of her wedding dress." To Matthias's surprise, Cora nodded. The two girls sat together by the fire, comparing their dolls and speaking in the soft voices children use when sharing secrets. Watching them, Matthias felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Grief for the normal childhood Cora had been denied, or perhaps hope that she might still find pieces of it. Later, as the camp settled down for the night, Peters approached. Matthias at the edge of the firelight. "Your daughter," the wagon master said carefully. "She seems, well, she's been through something, hasn't she?" Matthias weighed his words. "More than any child should have to bear." Peters nodded. "My wife. She's good with youngsters who've had hard times. Lost 3 of our own to the fever back in Missouri. If you ever need, well, if you're looking for a permanent situation, I appreciate the offer," Matthias said, and found that he meant it. These seemed like good people, the kind who would give Cora the stable home she deserved. But the thought of leaving her with strangers, even kind ones, made his chest tighten unexpectedly. That night, as they bedded down apart from the wagon train, Cora spoke more words than she'd managed in all their previous conversations combined. "The lady asked if you were my papa," she said, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "What did you tell her?" "I said I didn't know." Cora was quiet for a moment. What should I have said? The question hit Matthias like a physical blow. In 2 weeks, he'd gone from seeing this child as an unwanted burden to, what? He wasn't her father, would never be her real father. But somewhere along the trail, somewhere between her nightmares and his lullabies, between shared meals and quiet conversations, they'd begun to build something that felt remarkably like family. "You should say whatever feels true to you," he told her finally. Cora was quiet so long he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, in a voice soft as prayer, she said, "It would feel true to say yes." Matthias closed his eyes, feeling something crack open inside his chest. For 8 years, he'd carried his grief like armor, protecting himself from the possibility of loving and losing again. But this small girl, with her quiet courage and her doll named Hope, was teaching him that some risks were worth taking. "Then, that's what you should say," he whispered. In the morning, they said goodbye to the wagon train and continued deeper into the wilderness. But now they carried something new between them, spoken words that had transformed them from strangers, bound by circumstance, into something that resembled choice. As they rode, Matthias found himself planning not just their next camp, but their next month, their next season. For the first time since Martha's death, he was thinking beyond survival towards something that might actually be called living. The abandoned homestead materialized out of the morning haze like a ghost from someone else's dreams. Matthias had been following an old cattle trail through the high country when they crested a ridge and found the cluster of weathered buildings. Nestled in a small valley below, a cabin, a barn, and what had once been a corral, all slowly surrendering to the relentless patience of the desert. Cora's grip around his waist tightened as they approached, and he felt her lean forward to study. The empty windows that stared back at them like hollow eyes. "Looks like it's been empty for years," Matthias said, more to fill the silence than because she'd asked. Probably some family that ran into hard times. But as they drew closer, he could see that this place had been more than just abandoned. It had been left in haste. A child's wooden wagon sat overturned by the front door, its wheels missing. Clothes hung from a line between 2 posts, now faded and torn by seasons of wind and weather. In the vegetable garden behind the cabin, volunteer potatoes had gone wild, their pale flowers creating an accidental beauty among the weeds. Matthias dismounted and helped Cora down, his hand instinctively checking the colt at his hip. Abandoned places could sometimes harbor unwelcome surprises, but this one felt empty, in the way that only comes from long solitude. "Hello, the house!" he called out, following frontier protocol. When no answer came, he approached the cabin with careful steps, Cora close behind him. The front door hung open on leather hinges, revealing a single room that had once been someone's entire world. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold ashes still heaped on the hearth. A rough-hewn table sat in the center of the space, set for four, with tin plates that had never been cleared away. In one corner, a ladder led to a sleeping loft, where children's voices had once whispered secrets in the dark. But it was Cora's reaction that told Matthias this place held more than just the ordinary sadness of broken dreams. She stood frozen, in the doorway, her dark eyes wide with something that looked like recognition. When she finally moved, it was to approach the cold fireplace where a small rocking chair sat waiting for someone who would never return. "You've been here before," Matthias said quietly. "It wasn't a question." Cora nodded, her small hand reaching out to touch the chair's worn armrest. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Mama used to rock me here." The words hit Matthias like a physical blow, not Brennan's wife, Cora's real mother. The woman whose memory lived in the silver locket hidden beneath the girl's dress, whose absence had left a hole in a small heart that no amount of love might ever completely fill. "What happened to her?" he asked gently. Cora's fingers traced the smooth wood of the chair arm, following grain patterns like they were roads leading to somewhere safe. "She got sick. Papa tried to help, but she just got weaker and weaker. Then one morning she couldn't wake up anymore." Matthias knelt beside the chair, bringing himself to Cora's eye level. "What about your papa? Your real papa?" He started drinking after Mama died. Stopped taking care of things. Then the bad men came, and Papa tried to hide me. But they found us anyway. Cora's voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if she were recounting someone else's story. "They shot Papa and took me away. Said I saw something I shouldn't have seen." The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. The railroad money Fletcher had mentioned, the bank robbery in Messia, the desperate need to silence. A witness. Cora hadn't just witnessed a crime, she'd watched her father die defending her. "I'm sorry," Matthias said, meaning it more than any words he'd ever spoken. No child should have to carry that. Cora looked at him with those impossibly mature eyes. "Mr. Brennan said if I told anyone what I saw, the bad men would come for me. He said the only way to stay safe was to pretend I belonged to him, pretend I couldn't remember anything. Is that why you stopped talking?" She nodded. "It hurt too much to remember. And if I didn't talk, I couldn't accidentally say the wrong thing." Matthias felt a rage building in his chest, not the hot, explosive anger he'd felt facing Fletcher's guns, but something colder and more dangerous. The fury of a man confronting the casual cruelty that adults could inflict on children. The way fear could steal a little girl's voice and leave her clutching a ragged doll like it was the only solid thing in a world gone mad. But underneath the anger was something else, a fierce, protective love that surprised him with its intensity. This child had survived horrors that would have broken grown men, had endured loss and betrayal and violence, and somehow still found the courage to trust again. She was stronger than any outlaw he'd ever tracked, braver than any soldier he'd ever known. That afternoon, while Cora explored the cabin's remaining treasures, a hairbrush with her mother's hair still tangled in its bristles, a wooden top that had once been painted bright red, Matthias searched the surrounding buildings. In the barn, he found what he was looking for, a small harmonica, silver-plated and decorated with swirling patterns, half hidden in the hay where someone had dropped it long ago. When he returned to the cabin, Cora was sitting in her mother's rocking chair, holding the ragged doll and humming softly to herself. The melody was wordless but beautiful, a lullaby that seemed to echo with memories of better times. "I found something," Matthias said, settling cross-legged on the floor beside the chair. He held out the harmonica, its silver surface catching the afternoon light. "Do you know what this is?" Cora's eyes widened. "Mama had one just like it. She used to play for me at bedtime. Would you like to try?" For a moment, Cora hesitated. Then she reached out and took the harmonica with the same reverence she might have shown a sacred relic. She lifted it to her lips and blew a tentative note, clear and sweet, hanging in the air like a prayer. What followed wasn't music in any traditional sense, just a series of breathy notes and half-formed melodies. But to Matthias, it sounded like the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. It was the sound of a child remembering how to be a child, of joy returning to a heart that had forgotten what it felt like to hope. As the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the abandoned homestead in shades of gold and amber, Matthias realized they'd found something precious in this place of loss. Not answers to their questions or solutions to their problems, but something more valuable, the beginning of healing, the slow return of trust, and the fragile emergence of something that might eventually become happiness. Winter settled over the high country like a grey wool blanket, and with it came a quietude that Matthias had almost forgotten could exist. They'd made camp in a sheltered canyon 20 miles from the abandoned homestead, where ancient cottonwoods provided windbreak and a year-round spring ensured fresh water. It was the kind of place a man could disappear into and never be found, which was exactly what Matthias had in mind. The first snow came early, dusting the red canyon walls with white that made the whole world look like something from a child's picture book. Cora watched the flakes fall from beneath the canvas shelter he'd rigged between two boulders, her dark eyes bright with wonder as she caught snowflakes on her tongue. "Have you seen snow before?" Matthias asked, pausing in his work on what would become their winter shelter. Cora shook her head, then held out her hands to catch the falling crystals. When they melted against her palms, she giggled, the first sound of pure joy he'd heard from her. That night, as the wind howled through the canyon like something lost and searching, Matthias found himself doing something he hadn't done in 20 years. By lamplight, with his hunting knife and a piece of pine wood salvaged from an old deadfall, he began to carve. His hands remembered the motions from childhood, when his own father had taught him the patience required to coax shapes from unwilling wood. But where his father had carved practical things, handles for tools, pegs for hanging gear, Matthias found himself creating something different entirely. It started as nothing more than a way to pass the long evening hours while Cora slept. But gradually the wood began to take shape under his careful knife. 4 legs, a graceful neck, a flowing mane. A horse, small enough to fit in a child's hand, but detailed enough to show the love that had gone into its making. Cora woke to find him working by the dying fire, wood shavings scattered around his boots like snow. She sat up in her bedroll, clutching hope against her chest, and watched him work with the intense concentration she brought to everything important. "What are you making?" she asked softly. "Something for you," Matthias replied, not looking up from his carving. "A friend. For hope, maybe." He held up the small wooden horse, its features still rough but recognizable. In the firelight, it seemed almost alive, ready to gallop away into the darkness. Cora's eyes went wide. "For me? If you'd like it." She scrambled out of her bedroll and approached him with careful steps, as if sudden movement might make the gift disappear. When he placed the wooden horse in her cupped palms, her face transformed with a smile so bright it could have lit the entire canyon. "He's beautiful," she whispered, turning the carving over in her hands. "What's his name?" "That's for you to decide. He's yours now." Cora studied the horse carefully, running her finger along its carved mane. "Thunder," she said finally. "Like your horse, but smaller." "Little Thunder," Matthias agreed. "I like that." Over the weeks that followed, as the snow deepened and the days grew shorter, Matthias continued his carving. A wooden cup that fit perfectly in Cora's small hands, a set of simple toys, a spinning top, a pair of dice carved with flowers instead of dots, a puzzle box that opened only when the pieces were arranged just right. Each gift was received with the same wonder, the same careful reverence. Cora would hold each new treasure for long minutes, memorizing its weight and texture before adding it to the growing collection she kept in a small leather pouch beside her bedroll. But more than the gifts themselves, it was the time spent making them that changed something between them. As Matthias carved, Cora would sit beside him, sometimes playing soft melodies on her harmonica, sometimes simply watching his hands work. They began to talk during these quiet hours, not about the past or the future, but about small, immediate things. The way the wind sounded different when it carried snow, the tracks they'd seen in the morning frost, the stories the flames seemed to tell as they danced in the fire. One evening, as a particularly fierce storm raged outside their shelter, Cora asked a question that caught Matthias off guard. "Did you have a little girl before? Before me?" Matthias's hands stilled on his carving, a wooden doll he'd been making to keep Hope company. "Why do you ask? You know how to do Papa things. The lullabies and the presents and the way you check for monsters before I go to sleep." The mention of monsters made Matthias smile despite the ache in his chest. Cora had been having nightmares less frequently, but when she did, she would wake calling for him. He'd taken to checking their small camp each night before she settled down, making an elaborate show of ensuring no monsters could possibly be hiding in the shadows. "I was going to have a little girl," he said finally, "but she died before she could be born. Her mama died too." Cora was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness she brought to all adult truths. "Is that why you were sad when I first met you?" "Yes." "Are you still sad?" Matthias looked down at her. This small girl who'd somehow managed to slip past all his defenses and find the broken places inside him. She was watching him with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything, waiting for an answer with the patience of someone who'd learned that important question sometimes. "Took time. Not as much as I was," he said honestly. "You've made the sadness smaller." Cora nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Mama used to say that sadness was like winter. It feels like it'll last forever, but spring always comes eventually." "Your mama was a wise woman." "She would have liked you," Cora said, with the certainty that children sometimes possess about unknowable things. "She would have liked the way you take care of me." As the winter deepened around their hidden canyon, Matthias found himself thinking less about the men who might still be hunting them, and more about the life they were building in this temporary shelter. He'd always been a solitary man, finding peace in silence and empty spaces, but now he discovered that some silences were warmer when shared, that empty spaces could be filled with something better than just the absence of danger. Watching Cora play with little Thunder, making the wooden horse gallop through elaborate adventures while Hope served as a wise queen, giving advice from her throne atop a rock, Matthias realized that somewhere in the space between autumn and winter, between fear and trust, they'd stopped being two strangers bound by circumstance. They'd become a family. Spring arrived with the suddenness of a gunshot, melting the winter snow into rushing streams that carved new channels through the canyon floor. Matthias had been planning their departure for weeks, studying maps and calculating routes that would take them even deeper into the wilderness when Cora found the wanted poster. She'd been gathering kindling near the old Apache trail that ran along the canyon's eastern rim when she spotted the piece of paper wedged beneath a rock cairn. Someone had left it there deliberately, a message for anyone who might be looking. When she brought it back to camp, her small face was pale with an emotion Matthias couldn't immediately identify. She handed him the poster without a word, then sat heavily on the log they'd been using as a bench, clutching little Thunder so tightly her knuckles went white. The poster was official territory business, printed on good paper with clear type. But it wasn't the usual notice about some outlaw with a price on his head. This one was different. Missing child, reward 5,000. Cora Elizabeth Hartford, age 8, disappeared from the Hartford Ranch near Mesilla 3 months ago, believed kidnapped by unknown parties. Miss Hartford is the sole heir to the Hartford Railroad, a fortune valued at over $2 million. She has dark hair, dark eyes, and may be traveling with a man calling himself Isaiah Brennan. Contact Federal Marshal James Whitman in Santa Fe or the Hartford family attorney Mr. Charles Morrison in Denver. Reward for safe return. Additional reward for information leading to the capture of her kidnappers. Below the text was an artist's rendering that captured Cora's features with startling accuracy. The serious dark eyes, the stubborn set of her chin, even the way her hair fell across her forehead when she was thinking. Matthias read the poster twice, his mind reeling with the implications. Cora Hartford. Not some settler's unwanted daughter, but the heir to a railroad empire. The child he'd been thinking of as an orphan was actually one of the wealthiest people in the territory. "You knew," he said quietly, looking up at her. It wasn't a question. Cora nodded, her fingers working nervously at the wooden horse's mane. "I remembered when we found Mama's house. Not everything, but enough. The locket has Mama's picture in it, and her real name, Eleanor Hartford." Cora's voice was barely above a whisper. "She married Papa against Grandpapa's wishes. He said she was throwing her life away on a poor rancher, but she loved Papa anyway." Matthias set the poster aside and knelt in front of her, bringing himself to her eye level. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was scared." Tears had begun to track down her cheeks. "Everyone who knows who I really am tries to take me away from where I want to be. Grandpapa wants me to come back to Denver and be a proper lady. The bad men want me dead, so they can't be punished for killing Papa. Mr. Brennan wanted to sell me to whoever would pay the most." She looked up at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much. "I thought if you knew I was rich, you might decide to take me back for the reward money. And I don't want to go back, I want to stay with you." The words hit Matthias like a physical blow. In all his calculations about keeping Cora safe, he'd never considered that she might actually want to be with him, that this arrangement he'd stumbled into might be as precious to her as it had become to him. "Cora," he said gently, "that money, it's your birthright. You could have anything you wanted. The best schools, beautiful clothes, a real home." "I have a real home," she interrupted fiercely. "Here, with you, you're my family now." But even as she spoke, Matthias's mind was working through the larger implications. If Cora was really the Hartford heiress, then the men hunting her weren't just railroad thugs trying to cover up a robbery. They were after one of the biggest fortunes in the West. And there would be others, legitimate authorities, bounty hunters, maybe even hired detectives working for the Hartford family. "There's something else," Cora said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Something I remembered about the day Papa died." Matthias waited, sensing that whatever she was about to tell him would change everything. The man who shot Papa, he wasn't just some robber. He knew about the money. He knew who I was. Cora's hands trembled as she spoke. "He said Grandpapa had sent him. Said the old man was tired of waiting for his daughter to come to her senses and bring me back to Denver, where I belonged." The implications hit Matthias like a landslide. If Cora was telling the truth, and he had no reason to doubt her, then this wasn't just about covering up a robbery. This was about a family feud that had turned deadly, about a grandfather who was willing to have his own son-in-law murdered to get control of his granddaughter and her inheritance. He said after Papa was dead, there wouldn't be anyone left to keep me from my proper place in society, Cora continued. But then I ran, and they had to chase me. That's when Mr. Brennan found me and decided I was worth more alive than dead. Matthias felt a cold rage building in his chest, not just at the men who'd hunted this child, but at a system that would allow such things to happen. Money corrupted everything it touched, turned family against family, reduced a little girl to nothing more than a prize to be fought over. "What do you want to do?" he asked finally. Cora looked up at him with surprise. "You're asking me? It's your life, Cora, your choice." She was quiet for a long moment, turning Little Thunder over in her hands. When she spoke, her voice was steady with a determination that reminded Matthias why he'd fallen in love with her. "Courage. I want to stay with you, but I also want the bad men to be punished for what they did to Papa. And I want Grandpapa to know that I'm not a thing he can just take whenever he wants." Matthias nodded slowly. "That's going to mean a fight. Are you ready for that? Are you?" Looking down at this small girl who'd somehow become the center of his world, Matthias realized that he'd never been more ready for anything in his life. For 8 years, he'd hunted men for money, for justice, for the simple, mechanical satisfaction of completing a job. But this would be different. This would be about protecting family, about standing up to the kind of power that thought it could take whatever it wanted simply because it could afford to. "Then we'd better start planning," he said, picking up the wanted poster, "because something tells me we're about to have a lot of company." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed up from the canyon floor. Multiple riders, moving fast and with purpose. Matthias grabbed his rifle and motioned for Cora to get behind cover, but she was already moving, her small form disappearing into the rocks with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes depended on becoming invisible. The hunt had found them again, but this time Matthias wasn't planning to run. The riders turned out to be a federal marshal and 3 deputies, their badges glinting in the afternoon sunlight as they approached the canyon camp with weapons drawn but not aimed. Matthias kept his rifle ready but didn't point it at them yet. "You'd be Matthias Steele," the lead marshal called out. He was a lean man with grey-streaked hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades enforcing law in places where civilization was still more hope than reality. "I'm Marshal James Whitman. We need to talk." "Talk away," Matthias replied, not moving from his position behind a boulder that provided both cover and a clear field of fire. "We're looking for a missing child. Cora Hartford. Got reports she might be traveling with a bounty hunter matching your description." From her hiding place among the rocks, Cora caught Matthias's eye and nodded once. It was her decision. Stay hidden and let the adults decide her fate, or step forward and take control of her own story. She stepped out from behind her boulder, little thunder clutched in one hand and hope in the other. "I'm Cora Hartford," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon, "and I'm exactly where I want to be." Marshal Whitman dismounted, his hand moving away from his gun in a gesture of peaceful intent. As he approached, Matthias could see that this was a man who dealt with complicated situations before. His movements were careful, non-threatening, but ready to change in an instant if circumstances required it. "Miss Hartford," Whitman said, gently, crouching down to Cora's eye level. "There are a lot of people worried about you. Your grandfather's been looking for you for months." "I know," Cora replied. "He's the one who had my papa killed." The words fell into the canyon like stones, into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. Whitman's expression didn't change, but Matthias saw something shift behind his eyes, the look of a lawman hearing something that turned a simple case into something much more complex. "That's a serious accusation, young lady. It's a serious crime," Cora shot back, "and I saw it happen." Over the next hour, as the sun tracked across the sky and painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and amber, Cora told her story. Not the version she'd given Matthias in pieces over months of trust-building, but the complete truth laid out with the precision of someone who'd had time to organize her memories and find her courage. She told them about the night her grandfather's men came to the ranch, about how they'd shot her father when he tried to protect her, about how she'd hidden and watched and remembered every detail. She described the leader, a man with a gold tooth and a scar across his left cheek who'd called her grandfather by his first name when he gave his report. Marshal Whitman listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather book. His deputies exchanged glances that spoke of men hearing things that would require careful documentation and even more careful investigation. "Miss Hartford," Whitman said when she finished, "what you're describing is conspiracy to commit murder. If you're willing to testify—" "I'll testify," Cora said firmly, "but not in Denver, not where Grandpapa's money can buy judges and juries, and not without Matthias." "Now hold on," one of the deputies interjected. "This man's not your legal guardian. He's got no standing. He's my family," Cora interrupted, moving to stand beside Matthias with a fierce loyalty that made his chest tight with pride. He saved me when everyone else was trying to hurt me or sell me. If you want my testimony, he comes with me. Whitman studied them both for a long moment, taking in the way Cora positioned herself protectively close to Matthias, the way the bounty hunter's hand rested gently on her shoulder. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy some question he'd been asking himself. "There's something else you should know," the marshal said finally. "Your grandfather isn't the only one looking for you. We've had reports of other parties. Men asking questions in saloons, offering money for information about a bounty hunter traveling with a little girl." "How many?" Matthias asked. "Hard to say. Could be a dozen, could be more. Word's gotten out about the reward, and that brings all kinds of vultures circling." Matthias felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd been planning for a fight, but against a specific enemy with no numbers and motivations. This was different, a feeding frenzy that could come from any direction. That evening, as Whitman and his men made camp a respectful distance away, Matthias sat with Cora beside their own fire and tried to explain what lay ahead. "Tomorrow, we're going to Santa Fe," he said. "The marshal thinks that's the safest place to sort this whole thing out. Federal courthouse, proper security." Cora nodded, turning Little Thunder over in her hands. "Will you stay with me?" "As long as they let me. And after the testimony and the trials and all the grown-up things?" Matthias looked down at this small girl, who'd somehow become the most important thing in his world. "What do you want to happen after?" "I want us to build a real house," Cora said without hesitation. "Somewhere with windows that look out on mountains, and a garden where I can grow flowers like Mama used to. I want to learn to read properly, and maybe have a real horse to ride, not just a wooden one." "That sounds like a fine life," Matthias said, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't trying to hide anymore. "Will you want that too? Or will you want to go back to hunting bad men?" The question caught him off guard, even though he'd been asking it himself for weeks. For 8 years, his identity had been bound up in the work. Matthias Steele, the bounty hunter who never missed, never quit, never showed mercy. But sitting here with Cora, planning gardens and morning routines, and all the small rituals that made up a family's life, he realized that version of himself felt like someone he'd known long ago. "I think," he said carefully, "that I've been hunting bad men long enough. Maybe it's time to try building something good instead." Cora smiled, one of her rare, brilliant expressions that could light up the darkest night. "Good. Because I was worried you might get bored being just a papa. Instead of a famous bounty hunter. Just a papa," Matthias repeated, testing the words. They felt foreign on his tongue, but also somehow exactly right. "I think that might be the most important job I've ever had." Later that night, as Cora slept peacefully beside the fire with her 2 treasured companions clutched close, Matthias sat up keeping watch and thinking about the future. Tomorrow would bring danger. He could feel it in the wind, in the way the horses stamped nervously at sounds only they could hear, in the weight of the gold pieces he kept hidden in his saddlebags. He'd saved every dollar from his bounty hunting, partly from habit and partly because he'd never had anything worth spending money on. Now, looking at Cora's sleeping face, peaceful in the firelight, he realized he'd been saving it for her all along. For the house with mountain views, for the education she deserved, for the security that would let her grow up without fear. But first, they had to survive what was coming. And as Matthias checked his weapons one final time before settling down to rest, he made himself a promise. Whatever it took, however many men came for them, he would not fail this child the way he'd failed Martha. Cora would live to see her. House with the mountain views, would plant her garden and learn to read and grow up to be the remarkable woman he could already see taking shape in her courage and kindness. The pocket watch in his vest ticked steadily, marking time, as it always had. But now, those measured moments weren't counting down to another grave and another bounty collected. They were counting up to something new, a life worth fighting for, a family worth protecting, and a future that suddenly seemed not just possible, but inevitable, as long as he could keep them both alive long enough to claim it. Dawn broke grey and threatening over the high country, and with it came the sound Matthias had been dreading, riders approaching from multiple directions, their hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls like distant thunder. From her hiding place, among the rocks, Cora clutched her mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band she'd finally retrieved from the locket the night before, wearing it on a thin chain around her neck like armor against whatever was coming. She could see Matthias moving with deadly purpose, checking his weapons one final time, while Marshal Whitman and his deputies took their own positions. "How many?" Whitman called out, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. Matthias scanned the rim above them, counting muzzle flashes and the glint of morning sun on metal. 8, maybe 10, coming from 3 directions. Professional? Professional enough. Matthias chambered around in his rifle, the sound sharp and final in the morning air. These aren't drifters looking for reward money. Someone's paying good wages for this kind of coordination. The first shots rang out from the eastern rim, bullets whining off the rocks where the lawmen had taken cover. But Matthias was already moving, his massive frame flowing from boulder to boulder with surprising grace as he worked his way toward the canyon's narrowest point. "You men down there," a voice echoed from above, amplified by the canyon walls. "Send up the girl, and we'll let the rest of you ride away." "Counteroffer," Whitman shouted back. "Throw down your weapons, and we'll try to keep you alive long enough for trial." The answer came in the form of concentrated gunfire that chipped stone fragments from every surface and sent the defenders diving for deeper cover. But Matthias had fought in places like this before, knew how sound could deceive and ricochet in tight spaces. More importantly, he knew these particular rocks and crevices like his own backyard. "Cora!" he called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "Remember what I taught you about the back trail?" She nodded, understanding immediately. If things went badly, if the men above them managed to break through their defenses, she was to follow the hidden path they'd discovered during their winter explorations. A narrow ledge that led to a cave system only someone her size could navigate. But as the morning wore on and the battle intensified, it became clear that running might not be an option. The attackers had positioned themselves well, covering all the obvious escape routes while maintaining fields of fire that made movement deadly. That's when the unexpected happened. More riders appeared on the canyon rim, but these weren't shooting at the defenders below. Instead, they were engaging the original attackers, their sudden appearance turning a coordinated assault into a 3-way battle that nobody seemed to have planned for. "Who the hell?" one of Whitman's deputies started to ask. His answer came in the form of a familiar voice calling down from above. "Marshal Whitman, this is Detective Morrison from the Hartford Railroad. We're here for Miss Hartford." Matthias felt his blood run cold. Morrison, the family attorney mentioned on the wanted poster, which meant these weren't just random bounty hunters or hired guns. They were representatives of Cora's own family, coming to claim their prize. But the battle wasn't over. The original attackers, presumably the grandfather's men or railroad thugs trying to eliminate Cora permanently, were fighting back against Morrison's people with the desperation of men who knew failure meant death. In the chaos of crossfire and ricocheting bullets, Matthias saw his chance. The narrow defile that led out of the canyon's eastern end was temporarily clear, covered by the confusion above. "Now!" he shouted to Cora. She burst from cover like a small deer, her feet sure on the rocky ground as she ran toward the designated meeting point. But she'd only made it halfway when a figure appeared at the canyon's edge, one of the original attackers who'd worked his way around behind their position. The man raised his rifle, drawing a bead on Cora's running form, with the calm precision of someone who killed for a living. Matthias saw it happening as if time had slowed to a crawl, saw the inevitable trajectory of bullet and target, saw the moment when everything he'd fought for would be torn away. He didn't think. He moved. His own rifle bucked against his shoulder. The shot perfectly placed despite the impossible angle and his own desperate sprint across broken ground. The attacker pitched backward, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the sky. But Matthias's movement had exposed him to fire from the other positions. He felt the burn of a bullet across his ribs, another that tugged at his coat sleeve. Behind him, Marshal Whitman was shouting orders, trying to coordinate their defense, while Morrison's men and the remaining attackers continued their deadly dance on the canyon rim. Through it all, Cora kept running, her small form a moving target that somehow stayed just ahead of the violence pursuing her. She reached the rocky outcropping where they'd agreed to meet and turned back, her dark eyes searching for Matthias with an expression of fierce determination. She wasn't going anywhere without him. The battle reached its crescendo when Cora did something that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of staying hidden as Matthias had taught her, she stood up on the rocky outcropping and shouted with all the authority her 8-year-old. Her voice could muster. "Stop shooting! I'm Cora Hartford, and I'm tired of people fighting over me like I'm a prize pig at a county fair." The unexpected sound of a child's voice cutting through the gunfire had an almost magical effect. Weapons fell silent as hardened men found themselves reluctant to continue their violence in the direct presence of the very person they were supposedly trying to protect or capture. Into that sudden quiet, Cora continued with a composure that would have done credit to a seasoned politician. "Mr. Morrison, I know you work for my grandfather, and you men shooting at everybody. I know you work for him too. You're all here because of me, so maybe you should listen to what I have to say." Detective Morrison appeared at the canyon's edge, a well-dressed man in his 50s, with the careful bearing of someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than battlefields. His coat was torn and dusty, his face grim with the realization that this simple retrieval mission had turned into something far more complicated. "Miss Hartford," he called down, "your grandfather is very worried about you. We're here to take you home, where you'll be safe." "Safe like Papa was safe?" Cora shot back, her small voice carrying a weight of accusation that made Morrison visibly flinch. "I know what Grandpapa did. I saw his men shoot Papa. I remember everything now." The admission sent ripples through both groups of men positioned around the canyon rim. This wasn't just about retrieving a missing heiress anymore. This was about a witness to murder, about family secrets that could destroy reputations and fortunes. One of the original attackers, a man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek, made the mistake of trying to adjust his position for a better shot at Cora. Matthias's rifle spoke once, and the man tumbled from his perch with a cry that echoed off the canyon walls. "That's enough," Morrison shouted. "All of you stand down. This has gone too far." But the scarred man, even as he lay bleeding among the rocks, managed to gasp out words that changed everything. The old man said to make it look like the bounty hunter killed her. Self-defense gone wrong. Nobody would question it. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Morrison's face went white as he realized what his employer had really hired him to do. Not retrieve a granddaughter, but eliminate a witness while maintaining plausible deniability. "You lying bastard!" Morrison snarled, but his outrage rang hollow. Everyone present could hear the truth in the dying man's confession. Marshal Whitman stepped into the sudden silence with the authority of federal law behind him. "This is a crime. You see now, gentlemen, everyone's going to put down their weapons, and we're going to sort this out properly." What followed was a tense standoff that lasted nearly an hour. Morrison's men, realizing they'd been hired under false pretenses, began to lower their weapons and step back from the canyon's edge. The remaining original attackers, outnumbered and exposed, had little choice but to surrender or die. Through it all, Cora remained standing on her rocky outcropping, no longer the frightened, silent child who'd been traded for chickens and whiskey. She had become something new, a young woman finding her voice and her strength, ready to face whatever consequences came from speaking truth to power. The legal document that would change everything came from Morrison's saddlebags, proof of Cora's identity and inheritance rights, along with correspondence that revealed the full scope of her grandfather's plans. As Marshal Whitman read through the papers by the growing light of morning, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Miss Hartford," he said finally, "it appears your grandfather has been having you declared legally dead. The inheritance was set to transfer to a trust he controls." "But I'm not dead," Cora pointed out with the logic that only children could bring to adult complications. "No, you're very much alive, which means there are going to be a lot of lawyers with a lot of questions in the very near future." As the immediate danger passed and the prisoners were secured, Cora climbed down from her outcropping and ran to Matthias, who was bleeding from his ribs but still standing. She threw her arms around his waist with a fierce joy that made every risk worthwhile. "We did it," she whispered against his coat. "We won." "You did it," Matthias corrected, his big hand gentle on her hair. "You were braver than any soldier I've ever seen." Looking around at the aftermath of the battle, the captured men, the scattered weapons, the federal marshal preparing to escort them all to justice, Matthias realized that this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. Cora Hartford was no longer a hunted child hiding in the wilderness. She was a young woman with a voice, a fortune, and most importantly, the courage to use both wisely. And somehow, impossibly, she wanted to share all of it with him. 6 months later, the house with mountain views was no longer just a dream whispered around a campfire. It stood solid and real in a valley 20 miles north of Santa Fe, built with Cora's inheritance money, but designed according to dreams they'd shared during those long winter nights in the canyon. The front porch faced east toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where the sunrise painted the peaks in shades of gold and rose each morning. A garden stretched along the south side of the house, where Cora had planted the wildflowers she'd learned to love during their months in the wilderness: Indian paintbrush, desert lupine, and evening primrose, their blooms adding splashes of color to the high desert landscape. Matthias stood on that porch now, watching Cora practice her reading lesson under the shade of a cottonwood tree they'd planted the day they moved in. At her feet, a real horse, a gentle mare named Estrella, grazed peacefully while Little Thunder sat propped against the tree trunk, keeping wooden watch over his human family. The legal proceedings had taken months to sort out, but justice had finally been served. Cora's grandfather was facing federal charges for conspiracy to commit murder, his carefully constructed empire crumbling under the weight of his own greed and cruelty. The hired killers who'd survived the canyon battle were serving long sentences in territorial prison. Detective Morrison, his reputation ruined by association, had quietly disappeared back east. Through it all, Cora had testified with a courage that amazed everyone who heard her speak. Her words had been precise, unflinching, and utterly devastating to those who'd thought a child's voice could be easily silenced. The judge, in his final ruling, had declared her to be a young woman of remarkable character and wisdom, fully capable of directing her own affairs with appropriate guidance. That guidance came in the form of legal guardianship that had been surprisingly easy to arrange. When the court asked Cora who she wanted to care for her, her answer had been immediate and unwavering. "Matthias Steele. He's my family." The official papers were framed and hanging in the front hallway now, next to a new family portrait that had been taken just last week. In it, Matthias and Cora stood together on their front porch, his hand on her shoulder, both of them smiling with the quiet contentment of people who'd found exactly where they belonged. The photographer, a kind man from Santa Fe, had captured something special in that image, not just the physical resemblance that was starting to emerge between them, but the deeper bond that made them truly father and daughter in every way that mattered. The portrait showed other details too. Cora's new dress, blue with tiny white flowers that reminded her of her mother's wedding gown, Matthias's clean-shaven face, no longer carved with the harsh lines of constant vigilance. The way they stood close enough to touch, comfortable in each other's presence, in a way that spoke of countless shared moments and quiet conversations. But the most precious artifact in their new home wasn't official or expensive or meant for display. It was the worn leather Bible that sat on the mantelpiece, its pressed flowers still preserved between pages that had been opened more often in the past 6 months than in the previous 8 years combined. Matthias had rediscovered his faith, not in grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but in the simple daily miracle of watching Cora grow and thrive and become the remarkable young woman he'd always known she could be. The house itself was everything they dreamed it would be. 3 bedrooms, one for Matthias, one for Cora, and one that served as a library and study where she worked on her lessons with the tutor who came twice a week from town. A kitchen with a proper stove and windows that looked out on the garden. A sitting room with a stone fireplace where they spent their evenings. Cora reading aloud while Matthias worked on his carvings or simply listened to the sound of her voice. He'd given up bounty hunting entirely, though the decision hadn't been difficult. The territorial marshal had offered him a permanent position as a deputy, but Matthias had declined with thanks. His hunting days were behind him. Now he raised horses instead, good, gentle animals that he trained with the same patience he'd learned to bring to fatherhood. The work was satisfying in ways that tracking outlaws had never been, creating something beautiful instead of simply ending something ugly. "Papa!" Cora called out from under the tree, using the name that still made his heart skip a beat every time he heard it. "Listen to this passage I found." She read aloud from the primer her tutor had left, her voice clear and confident. "There is no greater treasure than a heart that has learned to love without reservation, and no greater courage than choosing to trust after betrayal has taught the cost of such faith." "That's beautiful," Matthias said, settling into the chair beside her. "Do you understand what it means?" Cora looked up at him with those dark eyes that had grown brighter and more trusting with each passing day. "I think it means that the best things in life are the ones that cost us something important, like how I had to lose everything I thought I knew about family before I could find the family I was really supposed to have." The wisdom in her words never ceased to amaze him. At 9 years old, she'd had a birthday last month, celebrated with cake and presents and all the joy she'd been denied for too long. Cora Hartford possessed an understanding of life that many adults never achieved. Her birthday had been a revelation of happiness. Matthias had invited Marshal Whitman and his wife, along with the tutor Mrs. Henderson and her daughter, who'd become Cora's first real friend. They'd filled the house with laughter and conversation, and when Cora blew out her candles, she'd wished for many more birthdays just like this one, with all the people I love in the same room. The gifts had been simple but meaningful. Books from Mrs. Henderson, a new saddle for Estrella from Marshal Whitman, and from Matthias, a music box that played the lullaby he'd hummed to chase away her nightmares during those first difficult weeks. But the real gift had been the joy on Cora's face, the way she'd moved through the celebration with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved and wanted and safe. "What about you?" she asked now. "What did you have to lose to find us?" Matthias considered the question, thinking about the man he'd been when Isaiah Brennan first approached his campfire with desperate eyes and impossible choices. The bounty hunter who'd measured his worth in captured criminals and collected rewards, who'd worn his grief like armor and his solitude like a badge of honor. "I had to lose the idea that I could only be one thing," he said finally, "that I was just a hunter, just a man with blood on his hands and no room in his heart for anything soft or gentle. And now I know that the strongest thing a man can be is gentle with someone who needs protecting. The bravest thing he can do is love someone who might be taken away." Cora smiled and leaned against his shoulder, her small weight warm and solid and absolutely real. "I'm not going anywhere, Papa. We built this house to last." The evening ritual began, as it always did, with Cora gathering her books and toys while Matthias checked on the horses. Estrella nickered softly as he approached, her foal, born just 2 months ago, staying close to her side. The young horse reminded him of Cora in some ways, curious, brave, but still learning to trust the world around her. Inside, as Cora prepared for bed, Matthias found himself drawn once again to the family portrait. Sometimes he still couldn't quite believe this was his life, that the frightened, silent child who'd clutched a ragged doll in a trading post had become this bright, confident young woman who called him Papa and meant it with every fiber of her being. The transformation hadn't been instant or easy. There had been setbacks, nights when old nightmares returned, days when grief for her parents would overwhelm her without warning, moments when the reality of her vast inheritance felt more like a burden than a blessing. But through it all, they'd faced each challenge together, building trust one conversation at a time, one shared meal, one peaceful night's sleep after another. "Papa?" Cora's voice called from her bedroom. "Will you tell me about Mama Martha tonight?" It was a ritual they'd developed over the past few months. Cora had become fascinated by the stories of Martha, not out of jealousy, but from a genuine desire to know about the woman who'd first taught Matthias how to love. She seemed to understand instinctively that loving Martha's memory was part of what made Matthias capable of loving her. "Of course," he said, settling into the chair beside her bed. "What would you like to hear about tonight? Tell me about the dress she was making for the baby, the one with the yellow ribbons." Matthias smiled, remembering. It no longer hurt to think about Martha and their lost child. Cora's presence had somehow transformed the grief into something gentler, a sweet sadness mixed with gratitude for love that had been real, even if it couldn't last forever. "She spent weeks on that dress," he began, his voice soft in the lamplight. "Yellow, because we didn't know if the baby would be a boy or a girl. But she said yellow was the color of hope anyway. She'd work on it in the evenings while I read to her from the newspaper, her fingers so careful with every tiny stitch." "Do you think she would have liked me?" Cora asked, the question she always asked when he told Martha stories. "She would have loved you," Matthias replied, meaning it completely. "She would have taught you to sew and cook and play the piano. She would have braided your hair and told you stories about her own childhood back in Ohio. Most of all, she would have been proud of the brave, kind, wise young woman you're becoming." Cora smiled sleepily, her eyes already drifting closed. "Maybe someday I'll learn to sew, and I can finish that yellow dress, just to honor her memory." "That sounds like a beautiful way to remember her," Matthias agreed, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Sweet dreams, little one, sweet dreams, Papa." As he turned down the lamp and closed her door, Matthias reflected on how the word Papa had evolved in meaning over the months. At first, it had been tentative, almost a question. Would he accept the title? Would he prove worthy of it? Now, it was confident, matter of fact, the natural expression of a relationship that had grown as solid and dependable as the mountains that watched over their valley. The evening stretched ahead of him, quiet and peaceful. He might read for a while, or work on the rocking horse he was carving as a surprise for Cora's Christmas present. Simple pleasures that would have seemed impossibly domestic to the man he'd been a year ago, but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting their valley in shades of amber and gold, Matthias thought about how strange and wonderful life could be. A year ago, he'd been a man haunted by loss, carrying death in his saddlebags and emptiness in his heart. Now he was a father, a gardener, a man who read bedtime stories and braided hair and measured his wealth not in gold pieces, but in the sound of a child's laughter echoing through rooms that finally felt like home. The pocket watch in his vest ticked steadily, marking time as it always had. But now those measured moments weren't counting down to endings. They were counting up to beginnings, to birthday celebrations and first days of school, to Christmas mornings and lazy summer afternoons, to all the ordinary miracles that made up a life worth living. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to be worthy of the trust Cora had placed in him. But tonight, as he sat on his front porch watching the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky, Matthias Steele knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. Sometimes the most precious things really did come disguised as burdens we never asked for. And sometimes, if we were very lucky and very brave, those burdens revealed themselves to be exactly the treasures we'd been searching for all along.